Hello everyone. Good evening and welcome to the National Museum of American Diplomacy. We're so happy that you are here today. We thank you for joining us for this special program celebrating the opening of this lovely temporary exhibition and this important intersection of art, architecture, and diplomacy. For those of you who this is your first time here in the museum, just wanted to let you know that this is the only museum dedicated to the history of American diplomacy, the history, the practice, the challenges, and the impact. So we are working towards the completion of our full museum, the entire 40,000 square feet, and our plan is to open our first two halls next summer. The hall above us will be the Definition of Diplomacy Gallery, and this will become the Impact of Diplomacy Gallery, including this will become our future education center. This will be our public programming and event space, and we'll have a temporary changing exhibition along that wall. And our first changing exhibition will be on our diplomatic gift collection. NMAD is delighted to co-host tonight's program and its accompanying exhibition, Treaties of Defenses, with our partner, the Foundation for Art Preservation and Embassies, otherwise known as FATE. NMAD's relationship with FATE reaches back to 2016, when they generously offered to display a reproduction of Roy Lichtenstein's Green Street mural in our museum upstairs in the upper level on the wall above the historic bronze doors to the State Department entrance. This serves as an exceptional reminder of how art and the role art plays in our country's cultural diplomacy efforts around the world. In the spirit of amplifying the impact art has on diplomacy, NMAD was excited to receive an invitation last fall from FATE's director, Jennifer Duncan, to meet tonight's featured artist, Jorge Otero-Pailos. As my colleagues and I listened to him talk about his work preserving pieces of the decommissioned U.S. Embassy security fencing in Oslo, Norway as art through his exhibition, Treaties on Defenses, that you have a chance to view tonight, we knew we had to bring this incredible exhibition here to NMAD in the State Department. It is such a powerful visualization of cultural diplomacy, and we are honored to have it on display here through September of this year. Many thanks to Jorge and the team at Otero-Pailos Studio for working with us to make this happen. It is now my great honor to welcome our distinguished guest, artist Jorge Otero-Pailos, author David B. Peterson, and our moderator, the esteemed Eugene Robinson, Associate Editor of the Washington Post, to the stage to begin tonight's program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, State Department. Thank you, FATE. Excited to be here. I'm going to speak very quickly, probably quicker than the slides move, but tonight's really about Jorge's amazing preservation, architecture, sculpture, art installation on Park Avenue. There are 3 sculptures. He's going to talk about that, so I won't do that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cold War embassies and the status of those embassies. So this is up here. I'll let you guys read it while I speak, but it's hard to exaggerate the fear and anxiety that occurred during the Cold War. Why was that? Well, a lot of people, many people, had experienced what had happened in Japan with dropping the 2 bombs, and this country was very anxious about what was going on in the world. And why did that happen? Well, we'll go to the next slide. A number of reasons. George Kennan's long telegram in 1946 talked about the Soviet Union's interest in expanding and increasing their presence. Next slide. And then in 1949, this was NSC 40. Sorry, I can't read this slide. Anyway, Truman issued NSC 68 that talked about the need to contain communism. So right away, it became expansion versus containment. Then the question is, how do you do that? You don't just say we're going to contain communism. So what do? Well, you build up your military. In 1950, we had several warheads, 300. By 1960, we had almost 20,000. What else do? You create an intelligence, you create an entity to gather information around the world. So we started the CIA. What else did we do? This is more relevant for tonight. We started something called the U.S. Information Agency. And what did that mean? Well, at the time, they were the largest publisher in the world. They were one of the largest broadcasters in the world. And their job was cultural diplomacy. What does that mean? That means soft power. That means bringing the benefits of a free and open society to the world. So it was TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, but it was also something else. It was also embassies. And many people don't realize that embassies were not just about diplomacy. They were about cultural diplomacy. And what does that mean? That means the embassies had typically 3 entrances. Jorge is going to talk about Oslo in a few minutes. But they had an embassy for visas. They had an embassy for the work of the diplomats. And then they had the use information services. That's up on the left corner. And what does that mean? They had art exhibitions. They had libraries. They had auditoriums. You can see here, these are some of the auditoriums and libraries. But they also had art, and lots of it. And in particular, the American abstract expressionists. And why? Well, it was a very free-flowing, independent, non-structured art form. And in fact, in 1962, this was the largest and probably the most prominent abstract expressionist exhibition in the world. And this is what Khrushchev said when he saw an abstract expressionist for the first time. Well, you got to go back to that, sorry, go back to that slide. By the way, that painting on the left sold several years ago for over $100 million. So maybe not so crazy. So let's talk about the embassies a little bit. In 1948 to 1962, I can't speak tonight without giving a shout out to Jane Leffler, who's here. Jane, in 1998, came out. Can we get around? Because Jane wrote the Bible about embassies. She had unfettered access in the 90s to the State Department files. Something wouldn't happen today, unfortunately. We live in a different era. But she wrote a very academic, intense book about the embassy building program. And my book would never have happened without Jane's archives and so forth at Columbia. So thank you, Jane. So we built over 25 Cold War embassies around the world, right after World War II. The team that built these embassies is almost like the best baseball team, the best NBA team, the best sports team you can imagine. These are the best architects in the world in the day. And it was an era where there really weren't starchitects, there weren't the famous architects, but these were the great architects of the world. And the State Department had the foresight to say, you know what, let's hire the best we can. And many of these were immigrants to America. So we're going to go quickly because, again, tonight's about Jorge, but it's hard to exaggerate how groundbreaking that building was. The dates here are the design dates, not the completion date. But 1948, international style, no ornamentation, repetitive windows, rectilinear, meaning flat lines all around. That was groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking. And for the United States to take the step to take that chance was really unusual. We did it, Harrison Rollins did it again in Havana. This was probably, I think, it's my favorite embassy, but it's also the most controversial embassy. That's Florence Knowles' furniture in the lobby. And this is what happened after Batista was overthrown by Castro. That's Castro's militia. I just wanted to throw this one in because it's kind of fun. That's the Soviet embassy in Cuba. Slightly different than, again, more this is Copenhagen, more international style, similar design. Then it moves quickly to a more contextual design. This is, you got to go back to that. Let's do, oh, sorry, New Delhi. One of the most famous embassies in the world, not this one, next one, sorry. Frank Lloyd Wright said this is one of the greatest American buildings ever built. Jackie Kennedy was there to help to inaugurate the building. Oslo, Eero Saarinen again. Jorge's going to talk about that very soon, so I won't talk about it. This is, again, more contextual building. Harry Weiss, as some of you may know, Washington architect. He basically took the wide-eyed palace and flipped it the other way. So that's why it's on effectively stilts. Why? Because of the climate and to keep the bugs and so forth away. But it was also built of mahogany, which helps to resist ants and bugs. And Harry Weiss was the architect for the metro station in Washington, some of you may know. Athens, Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus, 1919, 1933, thrown out by the Nazis. Most people consider Athens the cradle of Western democracy. The fact that the US chose Walter Gropius, who was thrown out of Germany by the Nazis, and he built the building with the same Pentelic marble that was used in the Parthenon. I don't think that was by accident. Great, great building. Still there. I know I talk a lot faster. London, Eero Saarinen, unfortunately, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's not quite what it used to be. Theodore Roosick's eagle on the front, 36 feet long, was very controversial. Marcel Breuer, well-known modernist architect. But again, the image of these buildings was to portray America as a progressive, open, democratic, free society. Here's the embassies. Basically the final Cold War embassy was, John Johansson was part of the Harvard Five, as some of you may know. He built it in a circular design on a triangular plot, Celtic design. It actually has a moat around it. And somebody asked Johansson, said, why did you build a circular building on a rectangular plot? And he said, because I wanted to send a message. And the person said, well, what message are you sending? And he said, because America never turns its back on anybody. It's a circular building, so there's no rear. And just a little footnote, there was only one female during the era that designed one of the Cold War embassies. So let's talk quickly about the current status, then we want to get to 1998. Everything changed with the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. John Kerry had something to say about the buildings that were built soon after that. Unfortunately, they didn't represent openness and democracy and progressive. They kind of look like prisons, don't they? I think Jane Leffler had an article called it Fortress America, and that was kind of the image of America at the time. More of the same. So of the 25 plus, there are about 7 still remaining. Most have either been sold or repurposed, unfortunately. We're hoping to save a few. Let's talk about 2 quick examples. London is not a good example of what you do when you decommission an embassy. It's a grade 2 listed building. What does that mean? That means, I thought it meant that you really couldn't do much with the building. They gutted the whole building, left 3 facades, added a top floor. Next slide, if you can see it. See the top, any of those design people, see the proportion of the windows on the top? They're completely out of proportion with the rest of the building. And the top floor was an accommodation, supposed to be public access in London so that the public could go to the top floor and see Grosvenor Square. The owners of the building decided that security was too difficult and did not allow, the public can't go up to the top of that building. So they got all the benefits. Oslo is a good example of what should be done. Again, Jorge will talk about his fence and so forth. It was on the cover of Architectural Record recently. It's really the poster child of how you repurpose, redo an embassy or former embassy. You'll see the next slide. Someone said it's now the most expensive building per square foot in Norway. that's how much it cost and how difficult it was to do it. So maybe it's not a financial poster child, but at least it was an architectural win. Of those embassies, 7 or so are landmarks of some sort, but again, it depends which city you live in. London, obviously, 3 facades doesn't really make, to me, doesn't make a preservation moment, but Athens and New Delhi, I think, will be around for a long, long time. And the new embassies, to finish, very, very encouraged. There seems to be a renewed effort of design and security, that they're not mutually exclusive. And for a period, I believe, we were effectively putting security first. Obviously, you got to protect your diplomats, so you can't argue against that. But again, I think we're learning that we can actually do both simultaneously. So this is the new embassy in Nine Elms in London. They call it the Ice Cube. People have different views about what it looks like. Another one in Vietnam that's exciting. Very open, very contextual. And finally, last slide, Jeannie Gang, my favorite architect, if we can see Jeannie, if we ever get there. One more. Jeannie Gang, great Chicago-based architect who's, I think, doing great stuff. Brasilia, as you may know, the capital of Brazil used to be in Rio, and then it was moved to Brasilia. So anyway, thank you very much. Let me turn this over to Eugene.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. That was great, and let us all hope that the period in which we were building those frankly hideous fortresses is an interregnum, and that we that we're in a better age now, because it does say something about the values of the country, and it sends a message, basically keep the hell out of here. Jorge, I just am blown away by the work that you did, and the show in there is great.
So everybody know that that's Jorge's work in the next room, that's all.
Right, and it is, and there's lots more of it. But let's start at the beginning. How did you get interested in the U.S. Embassy in Oslo? You're not Norwegian.
Yeah, right. Well, I have been going to Norway for many years as part of cultural exchanges. So I was aware of the U.S. Embassy in Norway. And it was really through Jane's book that I became aware that all of these embassies were being decommissioned. And I became interested in, how do we preserve them once they are being sold off? What can we do as an artist and as a preservationist and as an architect? I was very interested in that. Mm-hmm. So I began to talk to people, and Jane helped a lot to connect me up with people at OBO at the time to be able to start visiting, and brought students there, and we started to imagine what could happen. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning, but that was more than 10 years ago. Uh-huh. And then eventually the embassy was sold in 2017, and I was lucky enough to be part of the team. And when an embassy is decommissioned, people take the artworks out, they take different pieces out, but a lot of the building is left behind, a lot of things are left behind that seemed really important to me. Mm-hmm. That don't necessarily look beautiful or can be put into the category of art, and that was the fence. It felt to me that it was a very important part of the embassy. But how to preserve this thing? That was the question for me. So that's where I turned to art to try to save it, so that I could, give it a new life, and that's how this the beginning of this project came about.
So let's talk about the fence and why the fence. The fence wasn't always there, right? It was added at some point after the embassy had been completed and was being used. Tell me about that first.
So as David mentioned, after '98, there was a directive to protect embassies around the world. I think Norway was late in getting getting all the upgrades, and the fence was put up in 2002. So the fence was from 2002 to 2017. It was up around, and when you think about that, the embassy was built in '59. That's a big chunk of the story of the building, is to have this fence around it. But for me, more importantly, there is a fence already inside the building. So Saarinen, when he designed the embassy, there's an atrium inside the embassy, and it has balconies. And instead of putting a handrail on the balconies, he put a fence that traveled all the 3 stories of the inner atrium. And he did that because an embassy is really the people inside the building. The building itself is a chancery. And the chancery, the word comes from chancel, cancellus, in Latin, the word for gates, for fences. The ambassador is the chancellor of, of the mission. So he used the symbol of the fence to symbolize the chancery. So for me, it was very important that now there is this other fence outside the building. And symbolically, it felt to me that, this building is a chancery. We should save the chancel outside of it as well.
And in its design, the fence kind of mirrored or complemented the fence inside?
Well, I think it's actually very nicely designed, the fence, and it's incredibly tough. It's military-grade steel, hot-dip galvanized. It's, I got a tractor to take it down, and the tractor was a bit too small. So when we tried to remove the fence, we actually broke the tractor, and we had to go. It's like in the movie Jaws, where they go out and get a bigger boat. We had to go get a bigger tractor. It's a significant piece of defense material, and so that fence was designed, it turns out, by Davis Brody Bond, and Max Bond was the chair of Columbia's architecture program from 1969 to 1983. That's where I teach. So when I found out that, okay, my predecessor at school had designed this fence, it acquired even more symbolism for me.
Right, and so you're focused on the fence, and you've made the decision that there's art in there, that you can. I mean, that you can use that medium, but you've got to find tools, the right tools to do it. And how did you decide what to do with this tonnage, I would imagine, of fence that you somehow became in possession of?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because, as an artist, you have to think about what am I going to use to make art. And, of course, here it felt like I had to find a way to take down this fence. How do I do that? So typically, people would have just gone in and unscrewed it or, unwelded it, cut it. But I wanted to stay consistent with my process. So I was interested in the treaties that were signed while the fence was up. And reading those treaties, I think I'm one of the very few people that read, all the treaties that were signed between the United States and Norway. And, reading those treaties, I some words popped up for me, that were poetic. And each of those sculptures gets a name from one of the treaties. But then thinking more deeply about the work of diplomacy ends in a treaty. And I was like, what is a treaty? And a treaty is really an act of bringing, something out into the public. There's a conversation that happens. And the word treaty comes from the Latin tractus, which means literally to drag something over the earth. And it is the same word that is the root of tractor. And I said to myself, why don't I use a tractor to make art? Why don't I use the tractor to take the fence down? So I imposed that as a limitation for myself, to use as a tool brush a tractor, and because it felt like it was the right connection to the act of a treaty, to the act of taking something out and discussing it. And in fact, this exhibition, for me, is really an attempt to ignite a discussion about how do we preserve these amazing modern embassies that we built. You know, can we talk about this? These things are so far away. Most Americans never go to them. They don't know they exist. How can we bring that into the open? So my medium is art. I said, can I use art to try to get that conversation going? That's why these treaties, you know, to how do we protect these embassies?
Interesting. So your medium is going to be the fence. Your instrument is going to be the tractor. You get a tractor, you break it, right? I mean, you broke the tractor. Talk about that, and then what did you do next?
Well, I mean, you know, I was very inspired by the collaborations between architects and artists that were part of this program of the building of these embassies. And I knew I wanted to make, you know, a fence is a sculpture already. It's just two-dimensional, you know, and it sets up a relationship of, you know, confrontation, of frontality. It's, you know, one side or another. So I wanted to take the idea of this linear sculpture and turn it into a three-dimensional, that have some curvature, to go back and forth, to move across the line, to be more about that conversation, that exchange, to enact the exchange. So that's where I wanted the tractor to try to bend the steel, to try to give it life, to give it movement, which was not easy because, you know, I didn't want to heat the fence. I didn't want to, you know, do that. I wanted to use the torque of the tractor to actually twist it and turn it. So I didn't quite know where I was going with it. I had to really improvise along the way. I had a vague idea of what I wanted this to look like, but it was really in the process of starting to work with the material and the back and forth with the tractor that there was this dialogue, physical dialogue, you know, that I think every artist that engages in making a work of art knows that once you start, the thing you're making starts to push back.
Right. It has its own ideas about where, you know, what it wants to be. But I imagine that steel pushback more than like paint usually does on a canvas, for example. So how did that work? Because obviously you couldn't just kind of walk up and say, oh, I think I'll twist it this way or that way. But you were working with a tractor operator, right, and trying to say, let's try, you know, clockwise or counterclockwise, or folding this way or folding that way, and working it until you got an effect that seemed to be right.
Yeah, it was a process because, of course, once I wanted to give a turn and curvature to the fence, and that works in the tractor only. It's like trying to make a sculpture with one hand. The tractor only has one hand, so if you try to bend anything with one hand, you can't do it.
Yeah,
you need two hands to bend something. So, you know, when the fence was, you know, stuck on the floor, on the ground, we could bend it because it was still stuck. But the minute it came loose, we couldn't bend it anymore. So then we had to think about, okay, how do we keep bending with one hand? So I realized that the tractor actually has feet because it has the little, right, like the little wheels. So I asked the operator, why don't you step on the fence so you can get some leverage and then keep twisting? So that's how we were able to keep, you know, but that was all improvisation. So how do we, with the tools we have, how do we get to where we want to arrive, to the right shape?
And so some of the pieces that you made are really quite large. I think there's one that's like 5 meters high or something like that. And of course, for this space, you brought pieces that are not that size. How did you think about scale as you were doing the work?
Well, I started with pieces that were about the size of the original fence, which was about 15 feet or so. So I started with with pieces that were that big. Of course, when you twist something, it gets shorter. So then I assembled a couple pieces of fence on top to get that height back. You know, it's a lot of work, and so I did about 5 very large sculptures, and then I started saying, well, what about making something a little smaller? We started making some of these smaller ones. I made 51 of them in total, and the last one is teeny.
Well, that's understandable. So, but the fence, as your plastic material, is only a part of what you did, because when we look at the beautiful prints that are on the wall there, you have involved the treaties. You know, again, the same. It's more than the same word root. What did that connection mean to you?
So my work is always about trying to save significant pieces of architecture, of history, memory, and the physical artifact is just a vessel for that meaning. And so for me, I was really trying to uncover the meaning of these fences. Like I was trying to find out myself, like what's the meaning of this thing? And you know, I realized that part of what a fence enables is for you to actually see through it. It's not a wall. I mean, we have the Berlin Wall over here. You know, you can't see through a wall. You can't reach through a wall. So I was interested in the fact that a fence protects, but also allows for conversation. It is, for me, the symbol. I think it's very apt that it's the symbol of diplomacy, because it allows for conversation, but it also allows you to stay a little guarded, which you have to be, right? So I wanted to know what the meaning of it, what were the associations, and that's where it felt to me that ultimately what diplomats do is that they engage in these very complicated dialogues, and they try to reach out and converse, and what they end up with is a treaty. So the treaty, I wanted to kind of reverse engineer a treaty. You know, what was behind this treaty? How did they get there? You know, they end up with us. That the treaty, just like the fence, lives in a world of, like, it's a world of straight lines. You know, when you get to a treaty, it seems so functional, so clear. Everything is like a word that.
Yeah.
But you know, there is this whole back and forth, this complicated dialogue that has to go in to get there, and a lot, I'm sure, is left out. And so I wanted to express that, and that's what. So I rewrote the treaties, you know, and turned them into these artworks, which can be read at multiple levels. So when you see them from here, you can see a kind of calligraphic print. You know, it has it looks more like an artwork. When you get up close, you start seeing the text and you can read it. So it has that distance. It draws you in. You know, it has that proximity. It brings you closer, and then it tells you a story. But the story is not a straight line. Once you start reading, the text starts bending and curving, and you start reading your own story. You start reading something in the text that you are understanding. And so I'm very interested in the viewer of the artwork completing the story. You know, what does this mean to you as a viewer?
I find it interesting, actually, that in the case of Oslo, after 1998, when security had to be beefed up and anything, they did do they did make a fence that you could see through, that you could kind of reach through, that you that was not totally forbidding. And I'm just curious, David, was that really the case? Was that in other embassies as well, or was it more the sort of Berlin Wall kind of response?
I've forgotten what year, but it was right after 9/11, so it's probably 2002, something like that. Colin Powell was Secretary of State, And there was a mandate to create blast walls that were 15 to 20 feet high, setbacks that were 150 feet, fenestration, the windows and doors could be limited only a certain percentage to. So things changed very quickly, and it's one of the reasons these embassies are and have been sold is because it's almost impossible to retrofit them. They were built to be open and accessible in dense urban environments because you wanted the public to be able to walk into the library at an embassy or the theater or whatever. And at the peak, London had over 100,000 visitors to the library here.
Yeah.
And those are people just literally just walking off the street. So there was no such thing as security. And London did the best they could with bollards and guard boxes and shutting down streets, but that's a patchwork of not a solution. It's just a Band-Aid. And as Jane wrote about in her book, it's, you know, unfortunately, security just became the most important thing in the world, and it's hard to argue that you shouldn't protect your diplomats, you know, as much as you can. But as I said at the end, I think we're starting to come full circle again to say that you don't have to have 20-foot blast walls. You don't have to have 100-foot setbacks. You can hire great architects like Jeannie Gang and some of the new architects that are coming out. So, you know, unfortunately, the location of the Cold War embassies almost dictates that they're going to be decommissioned because they're, you know, right by streets and roads, and they're have setbacks. The new embassies are, I think, minimum like 8 acres. I mean, you can't obviously can't do 8 acres in London, and that's why Nine Elms
Cost you a bit.
Nine Elms is, you know, way 45 minutes from London, and nobody really wants to go there because it's in the middle of nowhere. So, you know, but we're hopeful that, I mean, I think New Delhi, as I said, New Delhi and Athens are in a big footprint, many acres there, so there's the ability to protect. But that was by accident. That just happened. But you know, you can't put up a fence like Jorge took down and adequately protect an embassy. You just can't do it. So.
You can't. Not in this day and age, and that's a shame. But maybe, you know, maybe as you said, we're finding some new and different solutions to that problem that allow at least some sense of openness and welcome and interchange, because that's kind of what embassies are.
Well, as Jorge said, he went to an embassy when he was young in Spain. It was his first representation of America.
Absolutely.
And do you want your first reputation of America to look like a prison? Or have his hand out like that to say, you're not really welcome here?
Yeah.
I mean, the good news is FAPE and some other ones are really working hard to open the cultural diplomacy of art and so forth again, but it's not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the security here.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's
And this is not an embassy, so.
we all deal with it. So, talk to me a bit more about, you read all the treaties, right? I mean, you've read every treaty between the United States and Norway, between when the fence was erected and the fence was, when it came down. Tell me about that. What did you learn as you read them?
Well, you know, I was really struck by the range of topics. So I had always thought that diplomacy was about trying to prevent war, by, you know, right? It was, but it isn't. It's about all these other things like exchanges in culture, education, research, exploration of the Arctic, of outer space, of, you know, it was unbelievable to me to learn the work of diplomats, like the art of diplomacy. And it dawned on me that, you know, David was mentioning that I immigrated through an embassy. It dawned on me that I'm here thanks to diplomats, you know, who did the work, who made it possible for there to be educational exchanges. So I came to the United States to study and then eventually stayed. So I learned about the incredible range of topics, from obviously defense is a big one, but all the intricacies of defense, well, you have to maintain the equipment, you have to exchange information. How do you exchange information? How do you dialogue? How do you do that as institutions? It's fascinating. So a lot of the work of the treaties is about how are we going to communicate in the future? And that sculpture over there, which is called Holders of Traditional and Local Knowledge, is about recognizing the importance of Native peoples when you are going to go into a place and do research. How do you talk to them? How do you engage in a dialogue? How do you incorporate their knowledge? So these were things that, I was amazed at the sensitivity, at the depth, at the awareness of diplomats, and how all this is reflected there.
Yeah.
And of course, my work is trying to bring out some of the complexities of that discourse and the range of the discourse, to open up the dialogue about the fact that, of course, when we think about diplomats, we only think about the text, but that work is happening in architecture, and it's happening through art. Art is I think when you see diplomats talking to one another, the first thing they show each other is a work of art, because it's a conversation piece. It's an icebreaker. They start to talk around art. So I think that's why the work of FAPE is also incredibly important, because what that art says is also the start of that diplomatic conversation.
Yeah.
And so I wanted these works to already be in diplomacy, to be about to think about the art of diplomacy a little bit differently. So it's not just about the product, but it's about the process. That's what I learned, in many nights of reading these.
Well,
but
it would take many nights to read all those treaties, and it would take
but it was also
maybe a lot of coffee.
In the reading also, because, as an artist, I read maybe differently. I'm on the hunt for something.
Yeah.
And so, I paused in different places, and I would draw on the treaties.
You found poetry in the treaties. I mean, you did, and and the way you chose the phrases with which to label the prints is just.
By the way, I think Jorge is the only guy in the world that could find poetry in treaties.
Yeah,
He did a great.
Yeah, I haven't seen that done very often, but that's really impressive, says the word guy. Anyhow, I literally could go on and on. I think we do have time for a few questions. Is that right? Can we do that?
Sure.
So we're going to take your mic, and if you could share your mic in the response, so Jorge will take that.
Yep.
Thank you, Jorge.
We have questions?
Yeah, you're talking about international, global, geopolitical. That's the realm in which we are sitting at the State Department. And I wonder if you can guide us through any sympathies that you might have on the domestic front. I say that we have as many cultures in the United States as we have zip codes. And the matter of using art and architecture, perhaps, as the point of departure for conversations across those cultures, what can you guide us for those of us who concern ourselves also with domestic issues?
Thank you. Well, I think that one of the interests of mine in this work is that art communicates in a way that is not reliant on language, so that you can speak different languages and still understand a work of art. And so there is text in these treaties. There are in that particular treaty, that one was signed by Norway, Russia, Greenland, all the Arctic region. So it has multiple languages in it. It's translated in multiple languages. So I think that for me, that's the power of art, is that it can bring people to a conversation across difference. And I think for me, that's the important thing is a dialogue. You know, you have to be able to engage in some form of dialogue. And a dialogue that is aware of its surroundings as well. You know, that the dialogues happen in particular places. Those places are charged. And so understanding the history of those places, the memories associated with those places, and acknowledging them without, you know, so that you can incorporate them into I think that's, for me, what I find the work of diplomacy to be very attuned to. It's that I think might be translatable, you know, to other contexts. And of course, every place is different, but I see your point that there is need for diplomatic dialogue everywhere. And at a very personal level, that's you know.
Can I add one quick thing? I think one of the most impactful pieces of public art of the last 10 years in this country happened the night during the George Floyd protests when Mayor Muriel Bowser had the giant words "Black Lives Matter" painted, you know, on 2 blocks of 16th Street right across Lafayette Park from the White House. And that was, to me, that was art that was communicating domestically in a very powerful way. And so, you know, Jenny Holzer is not the only text artist who has had impact. I'll try to speak softly.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about your comment when you're talking about the tractor, when you took the fence from the ground and you lost that leverage point, and you had to work with the tractor to kind of pin it down. I'm curious if you got any archival footage of that kind of dialogue with the tractor, because what's interesting is I think when you look at construction sites, it all appears very linear to us, right? The tractor comes up, they have a job, they're contracted, they're going to go take this wall down, it's going. But I'm wondering, when you were working in the project in Norway, if people came by and they saw this tractor, they just looked confused. And it was trying to resolve things. And it was almost like the artist's hand, but through the tractor. And if you could kind of see that, and I know there was a clip earlier of maybe it was your tractor smashing the fence, but I'm just curious how that, if you were able to stand by and watch the tractor as the artist, as you thinking and creating in real time.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
so the way we did it is I sat on one side of the fence and the tractor sat on the other side, and I gestured to the operator with my hands like this, because we didn't think to have like a communication device. We forgot that part, so it was all hand gestures, and so that's how we did it. But what I'm very interested, obviously, as an artist in craft and art is everywhere. And so I love collaborating with people, and these tractor operators are just extraordinary. So they sent their best people to do this because they knew it was going to be a little tricky. And we got to talking, and they have this competition every year where they use an iron claw, the very same thing we used to take down the fence, to open a can of beer. And so they have to be so precise as to be able to open, and whoever opens the can of beer wins. It's not easy, but they all almost get there. So it's a really amazing culture of craft and being able, they're really incredible craftspeople, and they can do things that are really not asked to do. So pushing the limits of the craft is also, for me, was very important. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, when the tractor died, it kind of, I say it died because it really did die. I mean, it exploded. It has these pneumatic tubes, that hold it together, and it was almost like it was the pneumatic tubes that exploded, and so it started squirting oil And it just like the whole thing just kind of went limp on the floor, and it was just like, oh, the poor thing died, you know. So we killed it. We asked too much of it, and so yeah, it was an amazing discovery of that whole culture of tractor operators.
So how long did it take you from starting to tear it apart to get it all down and ready for transport?
So I spent a summer in Norway doing it. So it was about 2.5 months. I confess I didn't get the whole fence into sculptures. I couldn't. I ran out of time. I ran out of money. I ran out of everything. So that's how I got 51 done. That was the 2.5 months that I had to do it.
So after it was down, how long did the sculptures take to fabricate?
Well, taking it down took about a day.
Oh.
And then we moved it off-site. We moved the pieces off-site, and I continued to work them over the course of those, probably like another week or so before I had all the pieces. And then I laid them out in a very large field. And then I went and used the pieces. So I almost did pieces of the puzzle and then used those to make the sculptures afterward.
My last question is, when you started bending it, was it still anchored into the ground? Were you bending it as it was into the concrete?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
then did you just rip it out of the ground once you got to bend you one, or did that just happen by chance?
It just happened. It just happened. You know, it eventually, so it was built in segments.
Yeah.
And so after a while, after enough torque, the segments popped out.
Just pop.
And that's where, you know, we
Thank
moved
you.
to the next segment.
I think we have time for one more question. I think this gentleman here, and then I'll turn the mic back over to Mr. Robinson for closing remarks.
Well, actually, I had the same question as Rick, but was the community involved at all outside of just you being in you know, at the site and then off-site doing the bending work?
So the answer is, in this work, no. The community was not involved. It happened so quickly. It was a salvage operation. It was going to be taken down. It was going to be thrown into the scrapyard. And that's where I stepped in and I said, no, we have to save this. So I had a conversation with the owner in which, you know, I asked him to donate the fence to me. And he said, sure. So then I was stuck with this, like, oh my God, like I didn't realize the tonnage now is in my property, and now I'm responsible for disposing of it. So that was very fast. So there was no time for like community engagement. I would say though that the Norwegian preservation authorities have been really, really at the forefront of how do you do this, because they were ahead of the game in terms of engaging the community before the sale of the building. And I think it was very important, Jane's book, and raising awareness about the importance of these buildings, you know, to some, I take small credit for contacting them when I was there and starting the process to work with students. They went in and had a dialogue with OBO before it was sold, and they were able to write a designation report and then announce to the world to say, when the embassy sold, we are going to designate it. So factor into your bids the fact that you will not be able to add another story like what happened in London, that you will have to preserve this building. So that was factored in, and it was a success story because of that. You know, that's a community process that took years. And again, there were little pieces of the puzzle there that you know, Jane's book got things going. So this, for me, you know, like is so important, because now David's book is giving new life to the importance of these embassies. There's many that remain. Many are going to be decommissioned. You know, how do we then engage the communities, our own communities, the public in America about the importance? This is something that I think is an incredible part of America's heritage abroad. So having a discussion about it and showing it to people. Most people will, the first time they'll set eyes on a U.S. embassy will be looking at David's book.
Jorge, I have one quick question. What's next? Any more fences?
Well, I would love to do whatever I can to save these buildings. I'm passionate about it. I don't know what's next, but I think it's important that they are imaginatively preserved and that they save that openness and that they were about cultural exchange to begin with. So yeah, I'm ready.
Well, Jorge, I want to congratulate you. I think you have made marvelous art. And I think it is kind of a miracle that you have brought this piece or these pieces of American diplomacy home to the State Department in a way. It's fabulous. It will be great if perhaps it will get a chance to be seen in Oslo someday as well, because it kind of lives in both places.
Well, I would be, so thank you, Eugene, and I have to say I'm honored to be in this panel with both of you, and I would be remiss if I didn't also thank FAPE for this incredible opportunity, and Jen for this opportunity, and also the National Museum of American Diplomacy, Todd and Lauren for this really amazing possibility to, if they had to build a museum for this artwork, it would be called this museum. So I'm very thankful, and I also want to acknowledge that this, as we mentioned, that there was a team involved. This is a team effort. So I want to acknowledge Laurence Laforgue, who is my partner in the studio, and who actually designed the exhibit. And also I'm very proud that our artist assistant, Abigail, there's Abigail, who was in the studio and worked on this project with us, is now fantastic artist in Baltimore. She came down for this. So this was really, and so many other people. And I also want to thank OBO because, and Curtis, because from the get-go, we were allowed access to these buildings, to work with students. So it's really a team effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Jorge, and I especially want to thank you, David, for explaining what it is these buildings are about, what's so important about them, and maybe helping us get to preserve them.
Thank you, Eugene. My hope, and I'll finish, I think Dublin represents the best and most prominent of the embassies that will be decommissioned that could potentially, I don't know what OBO is going to do, State Department, but there's a new site that's been selected, so that's not going to be an embassy, whether it becomes an American center, whether it becomes a representation of something of America, is my hope. And the great news is in Oslo, a very thoughtful preservationist business person bought it. So, but I don't know that that's going to happen very often. And so I think it will take an effort by the public, by a team of people to think about, is there a way to save some of these buildings, because otherwise they're going to be gone.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.